let's talk about how to know when you need to paint wet or dry or wet on wet or wet on dry or dry on dry or any combination of that. We're working with watercolor and we're trying to learn how it acts. So we're going to practice those things. Now, watercolor has to be wet to work, right? We have to add water to it, but it also dries, and paying attention to if it's dry or wet will help you find success and knowing when to paint it. So we're going to practice two kind of different ways to paint the wet on wet versus wet on dry. So I've already painted a dry circle. I painted it and I let it dry. Oh my goodness. I talk too fast and I trip over my own words. Please forgive me. Thank you. Okay, here I've got a wet circle, same value-ish, same color. If I want to add shadows to my circle that blend and mix smoothly, I want to do that while it is still wet. So I'm going to go into my paint. I'm going to wake up more red paint to make it thicker. If you're trying to figure out how to do value, go back and watch my value basics video so that you can figure out how to make your red darker. But for now, I'm going to add my darker red to just to one side. And because it's still wet, this will bleed and blend more evenly with the rest of my circle. Look how there's no harsh edges to my red paint. I also noticed I had kind of a darker spot there, so I'll just move that around. There we go. So that's how I can add a shadow wet on wet, and it will work well if you want a smooth transition, especially in a sphere shape like this. It makes sense if it's got a smooth transition because it's a rounded shape. If I were to do the same thing on my circle that's already dry, so I'm painting with wet paint on a dry circle, it'll look like this. Look how it has a hard edge. This is a very harsh shadow. It's almost as if there is some sort of distinct light or shadow. I'm going a little crazy with this. I think I'll just kind of keep going until it's got a nice little highlight. So it's created a much more distinct line to it and given it a bright little highlight on one spot. Hard edges are what happen when you paint wet on dry. Same for just any old shape. If you're trying to illustrate something or make a cute little design, let's say I'm painting, leaves have been my theme through all of these back to the basics videos. We'll go blueberry. So I want to make a shape of a blueberry. I want it to be a circle, right, with a hard edge. This was wet on dry, just like those circles. It has a hard edge to it. I want that little blueberry spike at the top. And that's wet on dry. Now, if my paper was wet first, so I took plain water, I'm gonna put that water everywhere in one area. Now my paper is wet. If I wanted to paint that blueberry on a wet paper, whoa, look what just happened. I can't really make it a blueberry shape when everything is wet. But what I can do is make a beautiful sky, because the sky is smooth with no hard edges. So I can embrace the wet paint on a wet paper to make a smooth, large wash is what that's called. And that is, again, a reason to use wet on wet. And because it's wet on wet, I can also use a paper towel and I could lift out some clouds in my sky. There's lots to play with when it's wet because you can pull it and push it and create this back and forth because the paint is wet and you can play with it in that way. Now, dry, there's something called dry brushing, which is when your paintbrush is mostly dry. So I'm gonna get some paint, dab some off. I'm leaning my paintbrush on its side. And now there's paint, and paint technically is wet, but look how dry it is. It looks scratchy. I love to use this when it comes to ocean or water because it looks like the sparkly surface. It also creates a great stony texture if you've got a bunch of rocks. So dry brush doesn't mean literally dry because that's impossible to paint watercolor with a dry brush, but it means that it's so dry that not all the paint will transfer to the paper. And usually when I do that, I have to lay my brush completely on its side. If you use the tip, all the water that's in the brush will go to the tip and it'll just make normal lines. So using the side of your brush helps you disperse what little water there is to make that dry brush happen. Wet means that something's wet, dry means it's dry. So painting wet on wet is painting wet paint on wet paint, or wet paint on wet paper. Wet on dry means wet paint on dry paint or on dry paper. Dry brush means that everything's dry. Your paint is dry and the paper is dry. All of these are super helpful and important techniques you'll use on every painting, and it's important to understand that terminology and know when you want to use what. There are lots of reasons to use any of them, and it all depends on what you're painting. So I hope that was helpful with some back to the basics. Check out my other back to the basics videos to make sure you are growing your confidence and you're having more fun painting. So I will see you next time. Happy painting.